Hey everyone, and welcome to my League of Legends Fundamentals tier list for 2023. Something I get asked all the time is, hey Shok, which fundamentals are the most important for me to learn? What should I be focusing on first? Because there are a lot of them out there. And you're right, while all the fundamentals are important, at least on some level, there are ones that are more kind of valuable to put your time into. And I'm going to try to answer that for you in this video. I will also put a link in a pinned comment below to my mid lane fundamentals playlist, so you might want to check that out. And I'll also put a link to my stream in case you want to ask me any questions about this. A couple more, I guess, like little disclaimers is that obviously there's like a mid lane bias to this, right? Like mid lane is my main role, and some of these are going to be different for other roles. But I think this should be pretty similar for most of them. It's just stuff like, if you're a support, is farming going to be as important if you're a carry lane? Probably not. So just like little stuff like that. But overall, I think it should be like really, really useful, pretty much whatever role you play. So quickly, which fundamentals do I find most valuable and like what am I really looking for? So the way I kind of approach League of Legends is when I'm improving, I'm trying to focus on things that are going to give me the most return in terms of like how many games they're actually going to come up. So if you think of some kind of like niche situation, like for example, like how do you play the game after you take Elder? That is like something that's only going to come up maybe like 1 in 10 games or something. And also there's so much gameplay before the Elder that could have affected that actual Elder fight, right? So I tend to value stuff that is like pretty much guaranteed to happen, and also stuff that affects the game earlier higher than stuff that's later on. So you'll probably see in this video as we go through it that I tend to value stuff that's guaranteed to happen, stuff like laning, team fighting, even champ slate, like stuff that happens earlier on and affects everything afterwards, more valuable or a higher value than things that kind of happen later in the game. Because like oftentimes the way League works is there's like some sort of like knock-on or butterfly effect where things that happen early, like if you win your lane, it's much easier to team fight or play out the mid game, right? That's just kind of how League works. But anyway, with all that aside, let's kind of get into it. As always, like everything will be timestamped, so make sure to check that out. Let's start with recall timers. So recall timers, I think, are pretty important. I'll probably put them in the A tier. And when I'm thinking recall timers, I'm thinking, you pretty much your base timings for all stages of the game. So this includes the laning phase. It also includes the mid game and stuff like that. I think that this is pretty important because it's like getting a good reset means you're not going to lose too much for it. There's also, kind of like times that are good for resetting. Like if you can, well, one, again, as I just said, if you can recall without losing anything, that's great. Stuff like recalling before an objective spawns is really, really good to make sure like you've spent all your gold and stuff before like you're about to do dragon. Even stuff like I see a lot in coaching sessions, people staying on the map too long and not being able to actually pressure, because one thing that happens a lot is like someone will be, say, half HP and they're still staying on the map. Whereas like a lot of the time for like half HP, no mana, you can't actually pressure the map. So you might as well be dead. And so I think recall timers are pretty important, I would say. And I also think that this is one where you can put a relatively small amount of investment into and still get like quite a lot out of. I think if you just kind of know the basics with recalling, it can be really good. At the same time, if you invest even more into it, you can get really advanced with your recalls, particularly in the laning phase, and that can have a very big impact on the rest of the game. Next one we have here is cooldowns. So cooldowns for me is S tier. Cooldowns is part of the laning phase, and I think the laning phase overall is extremely important. So there's a lot to do with cooldowns, and I've made a whole guide on this. It's both like your enemy cooldowns, your cooldowns, and just like kind of like knowing how League is a turn-based game. Like we'll talk about that more in terms of priority, but like what I mean basically is like if your opponent uses, say, like a 9-second cooldown, that's like a 9-second window where you can look to punish them. That's like your turn, right? And then if you use cooldowns on them, you also have to know how to respect. Like, okay, you've used your cooldowns, you've got your good trade, now you need to back off and like be a bit careful. And I think like cooldowns are extremely important for mid matchups. I'm not sure. I'd say like for other lanes, it's perhaps not as impactful. Like I definitely think cooldowns are by far the most important mid lane. So this would be everything to do with like punishing enemy cooldowns, respecting your own cooldowns, knowing how to like bait out cooldowns, like force them out as well, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's extremely important for the laning phase. Next one is trading. So as you'll probably see, I value the laning phase very highly. I think trading is extremely important. So this refers to trading in the laning phase, not trading objectives, which is something completely different. We'll kind of talk about that maybe a little bit more in the mid game. But trading, I'm just like referring to, it's kind of like goes hand in hand with cooldowns. In a way, it's like knowing what times to trade, like how you should trade, all that sort of stuff. So like, for example, like trading when your opponent has one cooldown is good. Trading when you're like level 3 versus level 2 can be good. Trading with minion advantage as well, or like once you have a lot of items, like trading even harder. So all that sort of stuff basically kind of leans into trading, and it just makes everything easier. Like you guys will probably notice that when you win lane, it's so much easier to do everything else in the game. Like it's easier to CS, it's easier to team fight mid game. Like it all becomes easier if you win your lane, and so I value laning very, very high. Next one is wave control. So wave control, I want to say is like a little bit lower in S tier, but it's still very important, and it's also like quite game to game dependent. So the thing is that wave control has like a massive, especially the first 3 waves, has a massive impact on how your lane plays out. After that though, like there's still stuff you can do, right? Like you can still play for freezes, you can still know not to push like when you don't have flash, you can try set up for ganks by pulling the wave on your side, you can push into people that are roaming. So there's like lots of stuff you can do with wave control. I would say like the first 3 waves are probably like perhaps the most important thing in the game in a way. I think just like the first 3 waves are so important for kind of setting the tone for your matchup. I'd say after that though is a little less important, and after the laning phase I'd say like there is side lane wave control, but it's not like that important. It also does depend quite a lot on what champ you're playing, because there are some champs that can just push all the time, there are some champs that can just freeze all the time, and there are some champs that kind of need to do a combination of both. Like sometimes they need to push, sometimes they need to freeze, and in that sense, like you can invest a lot into wave control and also get a lot out of it. It also, yeah, just has like an insanely high skill cap. Like I definitely noticed when I was playing pro still that there were mid laners that I felt like I would beat purely off wave control. So I think while it's not quite as important as trading and cooldowns, it's like if you invest time into wave control and you get really good at it, you will be extremely well rewarded. Now, next one is matchups. So matchups can be a little controversial because I think it does also depend a lot on what champ you're playing, but I'm actually going to put matchups in B tier. And the reason is I think while knowing your matchups can make a really big difference, I think if you know kind of these fundamentals, you don't actually need to know the matchup itself. Like for me, at least, even when I started playing pro and like I was challenger, I think I was probably like rank 1 at this point as well. People would always say like, to get high rank, you need to know your matchups. It kind of gets thrown out as like a buzzword. And I didn't really know what that meant. Like what does knowing your matchup actually mean? I think it's something that like doesn't, it's not very like explained very well. I want to do a matchups guide. That's one of the fundamentals that I don't really have covered. But I think it's stuff like knowing like how to itemize, like knowing how to trade, knowing which cooldowns are important. The reason I think it's a little less important overall is because I think if your trading and cooldown and wave control fundamentals are strong enough, then you will naturally kind of know how to play out the matchup. And while there might be niche things like, okay, maybe versus this champ you need to rush mercs, or this champ you really need to go like catalyst and bone plating, while there are niche things like, or not even niche, while there are things like fairly important things that can dictate how matchups play out, it's not going to be as big a deal until you're very high level. Like if you're challenger, I would say matchups are really important, but chances are if you're watching this video, you're like master or below, and I'd say at that point, like trading cooldowns and wave control should definitely take priority over that. Next one we have on our list here is itemization. So I think itemization is it's like really important, but it's also not at the same time. So the reason itemization is really important is because it has like a big effect on the game and it's relatively easy to do. That being said, more important than like doing the correct itemization is just having more gold, right? Like you often see even in pro games, pros itemizing honestly pretty poorly, buying items that perhaps aren't the best for the situation. But if you played against any of these pros, it wouldn't really matter if they were itemizing poorly because they would just have so much more gold than you. So if you want to spend like a little bit of time working out like how itemization works, even just like copying meta builds and stuff, I think that goes a very long way. And I can't understate or overstate. I can't emphasize any more. Like itemization is extremely important, but these are more important. You know what I'm saying? Like everything on this list is important, and matchups is such an itemization is such an easy way to get kind of an edge over the rest of the game. But if you're not good at these things, it's not going to matter. Like, think of it like this: if you're like bronze at these things and you have challenger level itemization, like what rank would you be? I don't know, like gold or something, or probably lower, like silver. If you were challenger at these, but you had like bronze level itemization, I honestly think you'd be like diamond or something, right? Like, or perhaps even higher, just because like having more gold and winning your lane and stuff like that is just more important, I would say. So next is runes. Now, runes I'm going to put in C tier. It's kind of similar to itemization. Like, the reason runes are very important is because, again, it's relatively easy to get a huge return out of it. Even if you like don't take the correct runes, as long as you just like copy what is like a meta rune page, you're probably good most of the time. That being said, there's a lot of stuff you can do in runes to kind of make stuff better. Like, for example, if you're in assassin lanes, you might want to take bone play, or if you're in lanes where you can't pressure, you might want to take scaling, like gathering storm and transcendence, or you might go like conditioning overgrowth. Like, there's a lot of power you can gain from runes. I don't think it's as much power as you can gain from itemization, but I just think like runes are overall not that important for time investment, because you can get like 90% of the way there out of runes just by copying someone's page, and like any time extra invested into that, unless you're already really good at the other stuff, you're probably just better off spending on the stuff up here as opposed to runes. Like, it's just got a lower skill cap in my opinion, and also like a lower return. I kind of feel the same way about summoner spells. So there's a lot of games that are actually really difficult without the correct summoner spells. I guess is like, okay, no, actually that's maybe not true. So when I'm thinking like summoner spells, what I'm thinking more is like which summoner spells are you actually choosing as opposed to like the usage of them. If we're talking the usage of summoner spells, like how to use flash and stuff, I'd probably put it higher, but I don't really think that needs its own section. So I'm kind of lumping summoner spells in the same way I think of runes and itemizations, like which ones are you actually choosing? And I think, yeah, there are some games that are very difficult without the right sums, right? Like if it's a cleanse game and you don't have cleanse, it can be tough. If you really need TP or exhaust for the lane and you don't have it, it's very difficult. At the same time, I think, again, it's like you can invest a little into this and get like a lot out of it, which is great. But it's like, if we spent, say, let's just say we spend 100 games focusing on our trading, like that is it's gonna do so much for you, right? For your entire league career, that's gonna be amazing. For summoner spells, if you spent, say, 50 games working on summoner spells, I don't think it would really do much more for you beyond, the 10 games, for example. Just like understanding kind of when you need to take which sum and why. So a bit lower for me. Next one is farming, and I would say farming is probably the most important thing in the entire game. It's every single game you will farm minions, and it affects every facet of the game, every phase of the game, excuse me. So like it affects the laning phase, it affects like after your first base, it affects like mid-game, team fighting, just everything. So if there's one thing to focus on, it should be your farming. And I think my farming guide might actually be my most viewed video as well, so I'm actually kind of glad for that. That means people are getting better at CSing. Now, farming doesn't just refer to last hitting. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people make. Farming is like everything from like being in the right place at the right time, prepping the wave so you can CS it easier, stuff like I guess like knowing when to side lane and when to not. Like, I guess there's other stuff that this could be broken down to, like side laning. But for me, I think that farming just encompasses all that of just how you get CS, making the CS number go up, not just last hitting. Because actual last hitting, I notice a lot when I watch people's replays, again, like in coaching sessions, is that for many of you, actual last hitting is not the problem. It's more that you're making things really difficult for yourself. Like, you either don't prep the wave very well, and then you have to last hit every creep as opposed to just like CSing it all with an ability. Or you're like sharing tons of gold and XP with your team in the mid game, or you never go side lane, or you're just like too far behind in lane so you can't actually farm, like all that sort of stuff. I actually think like most of you have pretty decent pure last hitting is mostly fine. Not all of you though. Some of you need to get back into practice. So next one is side laning. So I think this kind of depends a lot on the champ you're playing. So for some champions, you can get like you honestly get pretty much everything you need out of side laning just by going, catching the wave, and then coming back mid. At the same time, if you're really good at side laning, you can use it to build like a massive lead in the mid game. It can even make a lot of the games that you're very behind in able to kind of like catch up. Something I think a lot of people see is that when someone tilts, they often rage split. They just like push down a side lane, and A lot of the time they are just doing it without thinking, but to be honest, if you rage split intelligently, which I guess doesn't really make sense, but what I'm saying is like if you fall behind and you still split push intelligently, you actually bring yourself into the game like very quickly just off all the gold you can pick up. And obviously it is important, especially for when you're winning, because you can push the wave all the way to their tower. It allows you to just like farm and pressure the map so much more. So I think while for some champions, you don't need to push the side lane as much. So you still need to know like when to side lane and also like how far you're allowed to side lane, like how far you're allowed to push up. So I think this is pretty important, honestly. I wouldn't say it's quite as important as this stuff up here because, again, this is not guaranteed every game. Like this will happen typically after like 15, 16 minutes, right? And a lot of the game has happened before that. It might be that you can't side lane because you fell too far behind in lane, or it might be that you can't side lane because the game's already over 15 minutes, right? So I think it's not as important as these, but it's still very important. Next one is team fighting. So team fighting is definitely an S tier for me, and I think I would probably put it as like the lower end of S. The reason is it's kind of similar to side laning in that I suppose it's not 100% guaranteed that team fights will happen because like the game could be kind of doomed before that, but you know, how many solo queue games do you have with team fights? It's like 99 out of 100. You know, like there's always going to be like team fighting and skirmishing. And worth noting is that this includes skirmishing as well. Basically, any fight that's not a 1v1, I'm kind of including under team fighting. And I think that's extremely important because a lot of the game in League is decided by team fights. And the kind of time before it is used to make team fights easier. Like if you win your lane, a lot of the time in solo queue, you can't like explode the game in the same way that you could in like a team environment where you kind of like use your priority, you like dive other sides, you gain all the objectives, and then it might not even come down to team fighting, right? In solo queue though, the game never really goes like that. It pretty much always comes down to you do what you can for all the game to get yourself as strong as possible for what inevitably is like the team fights that decide the game. So dragon fights, baron fights, often, you know, there's just like a game-winning fight on mid lane for no reason. So I think this is really important, and there's a lot of things that go into this. Like I kind of broke laning down into these three fundamentals here. But team fighting, like you could probably break it down to stuff like target priority, positioning, kind of like champion identity, and maybe like team identity as well, just like that sort of stuff. I haven't broken it down, but I think if you want to know more about team fighting, just check out my team fighting video. I do think it's really important overall. So mid game is, I feel like I've kind of already covered this with the side laning, but I'll put it here as well anyway. I guess this would just be all the kind of stuff about like when to side lane, like when to farm camps, you know, like when to group, all that sort of stuff. And I think that all is pretty important. I'd maybe like, it's pretty similar with side laning in my mind. I don't think, again, it's as important as all this stuff up here, but I think if you have a solid mid game, it can really help you close out what is a good early game. Or if you had a poor early game, sometimes you can claw it back in the mid game. But I think it's more valuable to spend your time on this sort of stuff first. Next is champion pool. This is going to be another controversial one. So champion pool is sort of overrated in a way. I think that it kind of depends what we're thinking. So let me just put it here and talk about it. So I think that the thing with champion pool is it's like there's two kind of types of champion pool. We can talk about champion pool for climbing, and we can talk about champion pool for learning, because they're two different things. So for climbing, generally, I would say for purely climbing, champion pool can be kind of important. And the reason is that you can like artificially inflate your elo by having a good champion pool. Let's say you're like a gold level player, right? You make a lot of mistakes. Let's say you're really bad at laning and you're often caught out. If you play a champion that kind of neutralizes your weaknesses, like they make up for the fact that you have poor laning and they maybe like have some dashes. So a champion could be like Ahri, right? Or maybe Lux. So Ahri would have like sustain for lane, good amount of wave clear and a lot of dashes. Lux would have a lot of range and the ability to kind of neutralize the lane. What you could do is by choosing the right champions, you could artificially increase your rank. Like if you're really good at team fighting, as long as you nullify those weaknesses, you might go from something like gold to perhaps gold 1. However, the problem with that is you're eventually going to reach a point where your fundamentals in those areas that you tried to neutralize is so weak that eventually you have to work on it. You know, like, okay, if you do play R, you do try and mitigate these weaknesses. Let's say it takes you to platinum. The problem is now you're stuck in platinum, which admittedly is higher than before, but you've got a big problem now because your laning might be like a silver level, and that you're going to have to really work on that to bring that up. And also the champion that you're playing, something like Ahri or Lux, isn't that great for learning the laning phase in my opinion, because again, they're very forgiving, they're very neutralizing, and normally when you want to learn, you want something that actually kind of punishes you for making those mistakes, so it's obvious to you, like, okay, that went bad and now I can kind of work on it. So champion pool for climbing, I would put kind of high, just because it's a way to like inflate your rank, but it's still not as important as actual fundamentals. And I would say champion pool for learning is like a little lower. I'd probably put it like here. And the reason is that while you can play champions that kind of accelerate your learning, right? Like if you play a champion that's very standard, like people always very standard or very just simple are both really good. So a champion that's like very standard would be something like Orianna. This is a champion that has a lot of clear weaknesses and strengths, like she scales well, she has low cooldown so she can bully the lane, she's fairly immobile, so you're going to have to really think about, you know, your positioning and stuff. Basically she really tests your fundamentals, so I think that's a great champ for learning. Or you can play a champion like Annie, who is very simple to play, and what that means is you can put like your full focus away from learning the champion itself and just learn the fundamentals instead. So I think that can be really, really important. But is it actually as important as any of these things? No. I kind of see champion pool as like as almost like a vessel to allow you to learn these things. And your champion pool isn't that important unless you're like really, really high rank, like challenger, going for like really high rank, like high challenger. For most of you, the problem is like your fundamentals are so weak that it doesn't matter what champion you play. So that's kind of what I think, and hopefully that makes sense. Champion knowledge, this is pretty important. I would put champion knowledge in A tier. I think could maybe even go higher. I would say potentially about here. So again, like I think having a little bit amount of champion knowledge goes a pretty long way. Do you need to know literally everything about your champion? I'd say it's nice to, but ultimately no. Like I think for me it would be much better for you to learn fundamentals as opposed to champions in a way. Like the reason most people again kind of like play one tricks in that is because it makes learning the rest of the game easier. There is definitely like a fall off of like, you know, if you play say 100 games of LeBlanc compared to 1,000 games of LeBlanc, will the 1,000 game LeBlanc player be better? Yeah, for sure. It's a champion that does reward champion knowledge, right? But if you have 100 game LeBlanc who has like very solid fundamentals compared to an 1,000 game LeBlanc that has very poor fundamentals, you know, who's going to win? It's definitely going to be the one with stronger fundamentals. And you often see that where even some people in pretty low elo, like I've seen like people in platinum or people in like gold or silver or whatever, have a lot of games on a champion. But the problem is they can't really play it the way they should, because in my opinion they lack the fundamentals to really like understand the game. Despite the fact that they've got, you know, 500 or 1,000 games on the champion, the fundamentals are what's holding them back, not more games on the champion. And so queuing up 10 more games on the champ, you know, what does it matter at that point? It doesn't really do anything for you. All it's really doing is taking your time that could be spent on something else. While there is an argument that again, like playing your one trick allows you to learn other stuff, if you're just playing your one trick and not consciously learning other stuff, you're just hoping that somehow this stuff will be injected into your brain, like that's just not really how it works. Next one we have is Champ Select. So Champ Select is, it's overrated and underrated at the same time. I'd probably put it about here. So I think with Champ Select, knowing Champ Select basics goes a long way, but stressing about the Champ Select is bad. And I think that a lot of people kind of use Champ Select as kind of like a, as an excuse in a way, like, oh, this game was, and I'll actually say I'm like, I do this too, but saying like this game was really bad for me, so there's like nothing I could have done better. The reality is there's pretty much always gameplay stuff that can be done better, and gameplay is more important than Champ Select. But that's not to say Champ Select is important or not important. So I think that the things of Champ Select that are very important that you should, that are easy to pick up, is ideally you shouldn't play the same damage type as your jungler. Like it's pretty bad, especially as you get higher rank and people itemize better, to go like double AP mid or double AD mid, because it just makes itemizing against you extremely easy. So I would try and avoid that. I also think that probably the other big issue with Champ Select is sometimes people blind champions that shouldn't be blinded. And again, for low elo, that's probably fine. In fact, I would say like Champ Select might not even be relevant in low elo because you can basically just pick whatever. But as you get higher, if you play a champion that shouldn't be blinded and you consistently get punished for it, that can be very problematic. So at that point, you might be thinking, okay, you know, I have a counter pick champion and I want to pick a blind. Like I want maybe two champions in my pool, just one that's good at blind picking and one that's good at counter picking. Other than that, though, like while there are things that matter for champ select, stuff like, I think ease of execution is really nice just in solo queue, like having a wombo comp is nice. I think so many times, like I look at solo queue games and be like, yeah, this game's just lost in draft, and you end up winning, or the other way around, right? Just because gameplay is more important than champ select, especially in solo queue. In competitive, I think we could make a pretty big argument that champ select should probably be S tier, but for solo queue, I think it's quite a bit lower. So win conditions is our next one, and I think it's another one of those like buzzwords that thrown around, and I think a lot of people aren't really understanding it. I think that knowing your win conditions is really important. Knowing your team's win conditions, in my opinion, doesn't matter a whole lot. Like, I think it's much more important to know like what you want and like you need in the game and play towards those. Personally, I would put that under champion knowledge. But if you want to make it separate and put it under win conditions, it's probably somewhere in the B tier, somewhere like here. I think, yeah, maybe like here or something. I think, like, I don't know. It's stuff like if you know what you want out of the game and like out of your matchup and stuff like that. Like if you have something to work towards in the game, you really know that, okay, like I don't want to trade too much early, but I can trade after level 6. That might be like more of a matchup thing, but I kind of still consider it win conditions. If we're talking more like, I don't know, a win condition in terms of like, oh, our team's win condition is to poke and their team's win condition is to engage. Again, I think it's important, but do I think it's important as any of these like bigger gameplay things? No, I don't really think so. I would say this is potentially, in terms of like time invested, one of the worst things you can invest time into. Really, like having a basic understanding of win conditions might help you, but honestly, I'm like tempted to put it down here just because I think the relevant win conditions are covered by champ knowledge. I think knowing your team's win conditions is not particularly important. At least, like, that's kind of what I think. So these next three kind of all go together: jungle tracking, map awareness, and vision. And yeah, they all kind of they're all like the same thing in a way. So let me just kind of like explain all three. So when I'm talking about vision, I'm talking about mainly like where you're actually placing your wards. Okay. When I'm thinking map awareness, I'm thinking more you spot something on the map and like you see it and also kind of like react to it. Like, for example, you can like look at your map, but not actually see what's there in a way. Like if you look at your map and you see your support and jungler in base, that means like you should play safer because your support and jungle probably can't help you, whereas the enemy support and jungle probably can gank mid, right? So that's what I would be thinking in terms of map awareness. Not just looking at the map, but actually like seeing the map and like processing the information that it's like giving to you and like changing your play based on what's happening. Now, if we're talking like in that, I would say for high-elo, knowing what the map is telling you is insanely important. I think if we're talking like Master Plus, this is one of the skills that people like really need to work on. However, if you're lower elo, I would say that map awareness should probably go somewhere like here, because I think that a lot of you won't be able to like read the map and kind of see what it's actually telling you and know, like, because there's multiple steps, right? It's like, one, you have to look at the map, which is a struggle for a lot of people. Two, you have to actually like see it and see what's going on, like not just where people are, but like what they're doing and where people aren't as well, like who's not showing. And then three, you have to know like the correct response. Like, do you need to play back? Do you need to play more aggressive? You know, that sort of stuff. So I think this is very hard. And while it is very valuable to put time into, I think that if you're below master, I honestly wouldn't worry about this aspect of it too much. We'll talk about these ones because I think these are pretty important. But yeah, like if you're master plus, especially if you're already good at these other things, this is definitely worth putting more time into. But if you're below that, which I'm assuming most of you are, it's not a big thing for me. So jungle tracking. Jungle tracking, I think basic jungle tracking is really, really important. Advanced jungle tracking is not really important at all. I think if you have a basic idea of which side the jungler is on at all points of the game, like if you know, you just need to know, are they top side or bot side, pretty much. You don't need to know if they're on like Krugs, Red, or Raptors. You don't need to know if they're on Blue Wolves or Grom. You don't really need to know mid lane if they're like lane ganking or in base or anything like that. I think if you're a side laner, if you play like top or bot, this is arguably more important. Like knowing the finer details of where a jungler is pretty important. But for mid, all you really need to know is which side the jungler is on. And what you kind of do with that is you place your vision and then like hug towards it. So when I'm thinking vision, I'm also including like hugging towards that vision. So like if you've ever watched my like vision guide, you will know that basically like the way you can play around junglers and mid is pretty much all you need to do is like ward. I mean, watch the video, but you can ward like the opposite side of where they start and then like hug to that, and that keeps you safe. And then like at 4 minutes, you can swap back to the other side, ward that side, and hug to it. It probably doesn't make much sense if you haven't watched my warding guide, but again, it'll be linked in that comment below, so just go and look at that. And I think having basic jungle tracking and vision goes a really long way. However, I think vision is like overrated in a lot of ways. Like I think you don't need to buy that many pinks in solo queue. Like just having one for early game is really good. And I think like if you have really just like a solid idea of what basic vision looks like, it's going to go a long way. I'm tempted to actually put vision down here just because like honestly think you can invest like probably like 5 games into this and get most of it, just like knowing to like pink the right spot. In fact, I'm going to move it even down. I'm going to move it like here. Just knowing like pinking like the river bush, knowing that like wards placed further out are more valuable, trying not to push like if you don't have vision down, just stuff like that. It's all important, but to be honest, I honestly think if you're outside of high elo, all you really need to know is like which side the jungler is on and place a ward on that side. And sure, there's optimization you can do beyond that, like warding camps versus warding the river, you know, warding red versus warding raptors. Like there can be different choices, but I honestly think it just doesn't matter that much until you're very high elo. Now, Strongside Weakside, I think is, again, as you get higher elo, very important, because what will often happen is if you push aggressively on the weak side and mid game, you're almost certain to get ganked. I think also knowing which side is Strongside Weakside is important for like roaming and stuff like that. So this is pretty important, but yeah, I don't know. It's important, but again, there's just like more important things to work on. Like I'd probably put this like somewhere like here. It's kind of similar to map awareness in my mind. Obviously, I mean, the thing you're seeing, right, is that all the fundamentals are important. There's not really anything we can ignore. But I think as a mid laner, strong side, weak side isn't as important for early game. If you're a side laner, perhaps it's different. And then for mid game, it's pretty important, but you're not going to get punished for it a whole lot in lower elo, I wouldn't think. But yeah, it's something worth thinking about, especially once you've worked on like these things as well. Next is roaming. So roaming, I'm probably going to put somewhere like here, maybe there. The thing with roaming is knowing what makes a good roam and knowing what isn't a good roam is really important. This is not saying that roaming itself is particularly important. The big mistake people make in lower elo especially is roaming too much. Especially at bad times. I think bad roaming is one of the quickest ways to lose a game, because you're losing lots of farm mid, you're giving it back to your opponent, you're losing plates. Essentially, like roaming at the wrong time is extremely punishing, but roaming at the right time can be pretty lucrative as well. So I think it's pretty important that you learn what makes a good roam and not just like roam whenever you have priority. Like I think that's something I just see a lot. People push and they think because they're a mid laner they have to roam. Also another thing I see is people be like, okay, I'm playing this champion so I can never roam, or I'm playing this champion so I should always roam, sort of thing. You know, it's not really like that. You pretty much just want to roam when it's like good for like a good roam timing, right? And it doesn't have that much to do with the champion. Where there might be differences is if you're a champion that's like slower to move down the river or doesn't have CC, you kind of might need your roam threshold to be a bit higher. Like let's say we look at bot, we think of all the things that are important. I've talked about this in my roaming guide, but stuff like, you know, CC, HP, waves, junglers, all that sort of stuff. And we'd be like, okay, this roam has like a 50% chance of working. If you're like an assassin, that might be a roam worth taking. If you're like a victor, that 50% might be more like a 30%. And okay, maybe that's not really worth doing because Victor's so strong in the 1v1 and so good at farming that you probably want to extend that laning phase, not have like a lot of roam. So again, I have a whole video on this and I really am not doing it justice here, but it's worth checking out because I think mainly roaming is like one of the most misunderstood things in League. And so many of you guys, you just shoot yourselves in the foot by roaming at the wrong time. Tempo is another one that is like, it kind of goes in a lot of other things. Like I think roaming, recalls, even like side laning, priority usage, they're all kind of like parts of tempo. So the thing I'm kind of thinking with tempo is like, how well are you actually using your time? An example would be if you push in a mid wave and then you just walk away and you kind of walk in circles for 5 seconds, that's a very poor use of tempo, right? Because that's time that you could be using to do something else. It's also really important that you kind of use your tempo effectively. Like for example, if you pushing a wave to your opponent, that's essentially giving them free farm. So that means like you pushing that wave, it gives you like one wave to do something. It gives you like one kind of round of tempo. If you use that tempo to kind of like try and do more than that, like if you try and ward and then roam, I mean, I guess maybe we consider that under roaming, but basically if you had bad tempo or you like misused your tempo, it can be very punishing. I think this is something that people don't even realize until they're high load because it's not a topic that's really been covered. And to be honest, I don't have a video on it, and it's perhaps one I'll do soon. Let me know if you want to see a tempo video or not. It's mainly just like how effectively are you actually using your time? And I think that is pretty important in my mind. I want to say it's somewhere about here. The thing is, again, it's like tempo, I don't know. It's really important, I think, but it's also, you need to invest a lot into tempo to get stuff out of it. I don't think tempo is like very easy to understand at all. And I think like it's definitely one of the harder concepts to teach because it has so many like niche cases, and it's probably better as like an example video rather than just like a kind of lecture-esque video, you know what I'm saying? I just think like you really need examples to kind of see what is like bad tempo and like what that kind of leads to. I think that like most of tempo, if you just like kind of know stuff like the important ones, so like an example would be if you base like a minute before dragon, that's like a good recall timing, but it's also really good for tempo because it means you're going to be on the map in time for dragon and spend all your gold, and you're going to be there ready to set up early. So these kind of go hand in hand. But I do think like recall time is a bit more important. If you do eventually want to invest a lot of time into tempo, I think that can be very valuable. But I think that, like, I don't know, in terms of time investment, you're honestly better off learning something like itemization because you don't need much time. If you've already like gotten really good at all this stuff, especially if you're like Master Plus, tempo is like another great way to kind of take the game further. Is it as important as like this stuff though? I don't really think so. I'm actually kind of tempted to put it a bit lower. In fact, I think I might put it lower than itemization just because I think it is really important for sure. But it's just it's such a big time investment, and I don't think most of you are going to see a big return on it until you're good at all this other stuff. We're getting down to the last few ones now. I'll have priority usage, and I kind of feel like this is to do with both tempo and like roaming and recall timers, because choosing what you want to do with your prior, like do you want to roam, do you want to base and stuff like that, it kind of just all links together, right? Like if you know what good recall timings are, what good roaming timings are, you're going to kind of know what to do with your priority. Same with like wave control. Like if you know when you should push and when you shouldn't, like the understanding that gives you might tell you what you want to use with your priority. But I do think priority usage in general is pretty important. So for those of you that don't know, and I think I covered this, I want to say it's in my farming video, whenever you push a wave, you kind of have like, you have time to do something before the next wave comes. You generally have like one turn with which you can do like one thing. So you could like roam, or you could base, or ward, or push tower, or farm a camp. You can do all those things, but you generally can't do more than one because it takes you too much time. And that kind of ties into tempo, where like if you use your priority badly, you're going to be down on tempo on the next wave, and then your opponent will get the wave. So if you imagine like what you want to do is you don't want to seesaw prior. You want to just like keep prior. So if you like push into your opponent, you want to do something and then be back there in time for the next wave. If you're too late, what happens is your opponent pushes a wave, you have to catch at a tower, and now your opponent has prior to do something. You don't want that. You just want to like keep your priors. So I think priority usage is pretty important. I think I have a video on this from what I can remember, so it's probably worth checking out. As we get to our last ones here. So F keys, mechanics, and mentality. I actually want to start with F keys. So the thing is, I think unless you're like challenger or even going pro, F keys is almost a waste of time for you. If you've ever watched my stream, you'll probably see that I use F keys a lot, but it's similar to map awareness in that you need to know kind of like what you're looking at is actually telling you. You need to know what the response is. You also need to have enough of this other stuff kind of be habitual and internalized that you're not like losing out on this by using F keys. Because I think a lot of you in like lower elos, right, you're not good enough at trading in cooldowns that you can like do it without thinking. And F keys, I think until it becomes like a habit, which again takes a pretty long time, it takes a lot of like mental like capacity or a lot of mental processing power. So for me, it's one of the last things you should work on. But again, if you're like challenger and you're looking to go pro, F keys are insanely important. I can't understate that. They're just so important. And it's like F keys can tell you so much about the game, and it's such an efficient way to gather information. but you need to know what to do with that information. You need to know the correct responses. It's also way more useful, I think, in competitive, where you can kind of tell that information to your team, especially if you're a shot caller. That can make a really big difference. So yeah, one of the last things you should work on, but like every fundamental has value, and don't be fooled, like D tier fundamentals are still very valuable. Our last two now, getting to the end of this, mechanics and mentality. So mechanics is another interesting one. This varies a ton based on matchups and champions. So there are some games where mechanics are extremely important, like S tier. And there are some games where mechanics might not be important. So an example of a really intensive mechanic matchup would be something like Syndra versus Orianna. And that sort of matchup, the matchup is almost exclusively about dodging skill shots as well as punishing cooldowns, right? Like that's extremely important. And then if they have a bunch of skill shot champions, right, and you're playing a champion that also has skill shots, again, like let's say you're playing Syndra, the enemy team has something like, I don't know, what could they have? Like Ezreal, Luxbot, that's probably not the best example. But anyway, just champs with skill shots, and then they have like their Ori mid. Mechanics is going to be very important in this game. Not only do you need to hit a lot of skill shots, you need to dodge a lot of skill shots. Now for me, when I'm talking about mechanics, I'm talking more about like clicking and skill shot accuracy than I am about like actually playing the fights, because for me, that comes under team fighting. A lot of people see a good team fight and they say that's good mechanics. For me, that's not the same. I think that team fights and mechanics are very separate. Like, while mechanics can help you win a team fight, people see a flashy play in a team fight where it's really like nothing to do with mechanics. It's just like good champion knowledge and kind of like, I don't know, just like knowing how the team fight is played out. So team fight execution is different from mechanics. I'm thinking just like purely your clicking and your like accuracy with skill shots. Now, mechanics, as we said before, it depends a lot on the matchups and the champ you're playing. If you're playing a champion that doesn't need a lot of mechanical skill, I'd probably put it around about here. Yeah, like, I don't know, let's say you play something like Lissandra. I don't think you need to have great mechanics. Now, it's certainly helpful. Even on champions that don't require a lot of mechanics, having better mechanics is very helpful, right? Because it'll allow you to dodge skill shots that you wouldn't have otherwise dodged. It'll allow you to execute combos that perhaps you wouldn't have otherwise. So even on champions that aren't mechanically intensive, mechanics is very important. On champions that are mechanically intensive, I'd probably put them here. And the reason I'll put it here is because I think that it's like, if we're talking about mechanics, most likely the reason you're learning this is because you're playing a mechanical champion. And the ways you can improve your mechanics, I've done a whole video on this as well. There's lots of like techniques you can do. So for example, clicking close to your character, kind of like predicting as well in a way to like predicting where they're moving can be like considered mechanics, at least in my mind. You can also use like aim trainers and stuff like that. Now, the last thing I want to quickly say about mechanics is that a lot of people, again, use it as an excuse. So they'll say, because my mechanics are bad, I will never get challenger. Or because my mechanics are bad, I can't play this champion. And for me, a lot of the time I look at you guys saying bad mechanics and it has nothing to do with mechanics. I'm sure there are those of you out there that genuinely have bad mechanics. Mechanics can be improved. I don't think it's just like a genetic thing. I truly believe that everyone can improve their mechanics. But if you play the right champions, right, and you're good enough at the other things, you don't need to be really good mechanically to reach challenger, right? Maybe you need really good mechanics to be a high tier pro, but that's like, you know, if you're thinking about that, you're probably not watching this video anyway. So yeah, like, I don't know. I think it's just so often used an excuse to not focus on other things and just be like, you know, it's just like accepting defeat almost. My mechanics aren't good, so I'm just like not even going to try. I think it's really pathetic actually when people say that. And I guess the last thing, or another thing I'll kind of bring up about it, is that when we're like talking about all these fundamentals, right, there are many different ways to be challenger, right? So when I had a video on this about, I think a while ago, about improving, and challenger is just like about, and every rank actually, it's just like an average of your fundamentals. So if you're like really, really good at a lot of fundamentals, you're probably going to be challenger even if you're bad at other ones. Let's say you're like a 9 out of 10 in all these things up here, and then you're like an 8 out of 10 in all these things here, and your mechanics are like a 3, you would probably still be challenger because you're really good at all these other things, right? And even when I play in challenger, there's lots of people where I'm like, oh, this guy's like really good at laning, but maybe his team fighting's not as good. Or like this guy, he has really good mechanics and champion knowledge, but unfortunately for him, like his wave control or farming or something is really poor. So even challengers can be like obviously as you get higher rank, people tend to get more well-rounded, but even challenges have strengths and weaknesses. And especially if we're talking about getting to ranks below that, something like diamond, there are so many different ways to get diamond. There are people that get to diamond having like master level team fighting and gold level laning. I don't think that's like uncommon at all. And one thing that's really important about this is you should have like a really good idea of kind of like which fundamentals are important and which ones aren't, and then like which ones do you need to work on first. Like if you're really good, let's say for example that you're like a 9 out of 10 at 4 of these and you're like a 3 out of 10 at team fighting. Team fighting is not only really important, but it's much easier to improve your 3 to a 4 or even a 5 than it is to take your 9 to like a 9.5, right? There's diminishing returns. So you should have an idea of like, you know, which are most important and which are you weakest at, and try and bring those ones up. Our very last one is mentality, and this can mean a lot of different things. So a lot of people, when they mean mentality, they'll kind of think improvement mindset. Some people, when they think mentality, they will mean like not being toxic and stuff like that, or being like a good teammate and whatever. Personally, I think mentality, it's kind of like the champion pool in a way that having a good mentality allows you to learn the rest of this, but there are plenty of people in high elo that have terrible mentalities. So I would probably put mentality, I don't know, it really depends kind of like what you mean by mentality. Like having a good mentality is extremely important because it allows you to learn everything else. But as an actual like gameplay fundamental, is mentality that important? I would say no. So I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm actually curious. Like let me know in the comments what you think, because yeah, I guess I should put it in S tier. Like it's extremely important for allowing yourself to learn, but also somehow there are plenty of people that learn stuff like this despite being like toxic and despite having like tons of excuses and shit. So I actually don't really know where I should put this. It really depends, I think, where you value it. But I think I'll just put it here for now. I'd really be interested in hearing what you guys have to say about it though in the comment section. So I guess that's going to be it for the tier list. Once again, like it's my opinion, and it's real hard, right? Like we're doing all League of Legends fundamentals across like all roles and all champs, and I don't play all roles and all champs, and also like it's just my opinion, right? It's going to be really different from champ to champ. It's probably going to be different player to player depending on what they value. For me, I think I've tried to like explain why I value the things. Like I value the early game higher and things that are more guaranteed to happen much higher. And I've tried to give like some reasoning, at least for all of this, but at the end of the day, like plenty of people will disagree, and there's nothing wrong with that. And also, I guess like last thing, because I know people will just like clip this out of context and like look at some of these in low tier, every fundamental is important, every single one. These are so important, even like the D tier and C tier ones, but it's about like time investment. And I think one thing is the time's not infinite for all of us, right? Like we only have so much time to spend on the game, and you're much better off spending your time learning these big fundamentals that are going to impact every single game for the rest of your league career in a big way than it is to spend the time on things that are perhaps more niche. So I think that's finally it. Let me know what you guys think. It was a pretty long video and my voice is pretty tired. Also, please check out my stream, twitch.tv/ShokLol. And if you have any questions about this, please just put it in the Twitch chat or leave it in the comment section below. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.